Welcome to the Middlesex Moments radio show. I'm Christine Witkowski, professor of environmental science at Middlesex Community College, standing in for Dr. Anna Furmasky, who could not be here today. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest, Diana Furmasky, author of Rosalie Edge, Hawk of Mercy, the activist who saved nature from the conservationists. Diana is visiting Middletown as a guest of the Rockefeller Foundation in honor of the 50th anniversary of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. She also visited Middlesex to speak to our students. Welcome, Diana.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I know that when I first picked up your book, I had never heard of Rosalie Edge, and it was really an incredible story. I couldn't put it down. Maybe you could start us off by telling us who was Rosalie Edge and her connection to the better-known Rachel Carson.
Rosalie Edge is a person who deserves to be acknowledged as the mother of the environmental movement. She was a New York socialite, born in 1877. She died in 1962 at the age of 85, just weeks after the publication of Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. The publication of that book, which Rosalie Edge in some ways helped make possible, eclipsed her, and she disappeared. There were other reasons she disappeared, but she was not the typical conservationist as we think of them. Someone like John Muir, Teddy Roosevelt, eventually Rachel Carson, they all fit our mold. Rosalie Edge does not.
And so what we're talking about this year, when we talk about the 50th anniversary of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, it's also the 50th anniversary of Rosalie Edge's death.
Yes.
And a great opportunity for us to really spread the word about who she is and who she was and what she did.
What she made possible, and the fact that the Silent Spring was claimed to be the beginning of the environmental movement. It's a beautiful work, and it was one that really did usher in the era of environmentalism with laws about protection of nature. But without Rosalie Edge's previous work, we really would not have gotten there when we did, perhaps. Rosalie Edge turned inside and found the strength to go after the use of pesticides beginning in 1929, to stop the slaughter of bald eagles and hawks, to establish the first hawk sanctuary and birds of prey sanctuary where Rachel Carson went for her data. To write Silent Spring. Rachel Carson needed that data, and she does attribute Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. She does mention it as an important place in this history, although she does not mention Rosalie Edge. And Rosalie Edge was also responsible for the creation of Olympic National Park, worked on Kings Canyon National Park, brought in 8,000 acres of endangered sugar pines at Yosemite, and influenced the founders of the Nature Conservancy, the Wilderness Society, the Environmental Defense Fund, reformed the National Audubon Society, and the Sierra Club. There is no other conservationist in the 20th century who had that broad of an influence.
Wow, incredible how much influence she really had. We're going to continue this conversation after a short break, and when we come back, let's explore some of Rosalie Edge's background and how it led her to the incredible contributions that she made to the conservation movement. Welcome back. With me today is Diana Furmasky, author of Rosalie Edge, Hawk of Mercy, the activist who saved nature from the conservationists. We were talking about who is Rosalie Edge. So Diana, could you talk about her background, maybe a little bit about her childhood and her experiences in the suffrage movement and how those things shaped her?
As I mentioned, Rosalie Edge was born in 1877, the Gilded Age in New York City, into a wealthy family. Her father was one of New York's first accountants. He was a first cousin of Charles Dickens, and the family was very into Dickens. He was like a member of the family. They would quote his novels all the time when she was growing up. So she was a very bookish child. She was also a spoiled child. Her father adored her, obviously more than he adored his other children. She was the youngest. And he did the unspeakable thing of dying when she was 8 years old, which left the family in some precarious financial circumstances, since he didn't have all the paperwork. He wasn't expecting to die. It was an accident. There was some great fear that they would lose their social status, which had been really in the same circles of friendship with the Vanderbilt family, with the Carnegies. So she was very well placed. But with her father's death, things got a little dicey. It wasn't as dicey as she led people to believe. They were quite comfortable, and they did have to move out of the mansion in where maybe it was Gramercy Park at that point, and into a lovely brownstone on the Upper East Side in the 1880s. But it was a major blow, and she didn't marry until late. She married a British civil engineer, interestingly British like her father, and she went to Asia against her mother's wishes in 1909 to marry this complete stranger. And they were married in Tokyo. Excuse me, no, not in Tokyo. It escapes me right now. But, and they traveled around Asia. And he would build railroads in China and Indonesia and Japan, all over. So it was a very interesting life. She wrote lots of letters home. She began noticing things about the natural world. She began noticing how elephants were mistreated in Siam, and she mentioned that in her letters. She thought the tiger hunts were not so good, and she actually bought her first pair of binoculars not to view birds, but to see the emerald Buddha up close in Siam. So she was not that aware of nature. And it was on a trip moving back to the United States in 1913 that she met a leading suffragist from England, a lady Rhonda, whose daughter at that point was starving herself to death in prison in England for protesting and making trouble that would lead to women's right to vote in England. And Rosalie went home pregnant with her second child and was saying, I'm going to get into that. I can see myself doing that sort of work when I get to New York. So she didn't. She had a child, and then she had another one, and her husband, who became a stockbroker, was busy, and you know how life gets full. So she did not keep her promise to herself until 1915. And unusual incidents converge and make her aware of her promise. Actually, it was the fact that the daughter, Lady Rhonda's daughter, who had been a suffragist, had just been on the Lusitania and which had been torpedoed, and suddenly Rosalie Edge becomes aware, oh my goodness, this woman who got me into this awareness, I need to do something to get back into the suffrage movement. So she joined the suffrage movement. She became an officer. She worked with Carrie Chapman Catt. The work came naturally to her because she was a very, very strong woman for that time with really no outlet. Suffrage was perfect for her. And she was present when women got the right to vote. She marched in the streets. I have her original banners. And in her unpublished writings that were things given to me for the research, she talked about how the suffrage movement made her an activist, and it taught her how to stand up at meeting, as she said, and give people a hard time about what they were doing. So that was her background, her training. Then she had a major crisis in her marriage. She, it seems, found a letter that her husband had written to another woman that broke her heart, that broke up the marriage, and she and her husband, Charles Noel Edge, never lived together again. She fled the house that night after possibly an incident of domestic violence. She may or may not have had a broken arm, but she certainly did get hurt when he came after her. And she fled with her 2 children back to New York, to their house in New York from their country house in Rye. And she went into what her son Peter called a fallow stage for about 5 years. She was just stricken. Just could not believe that her life as this wealthy, up-and-coming socialite was over. And she couldn't tell anybody about that. But for comfort, she began watching birds. They gave her great relief. She said they gave her solace for her soul. And she began to identify increasingly with birds that were not so well liked, like birds of prey, hawks, eagles, detested birds at that time. But because of her nature, she connected to these birds that were betrayed in a way by bird conservation organizations because they were not saved at that point. Bald eagles and all kinds of raptors were detested. And she became their champion. But it was this tremendous betrayal of her in her marriage, in a way her father's death. My husband, a psychiatrist, likes to say that's an early betrayal. And then the Audubon Society, which was one of the organizations that should have been watching for the destruction of bald eagles and hawks. So it was that enormous welling up of outrage and identification, I feel, with species that were not appreciated.
Maybe you could talk a little bit more about why eagles and hawks at that time were vilified in the way that they were, because certainly here in Connecticut, most of our residents love the eagles that come down the Connecticut River and go out on boat trips to watch them, and you know, most people today share that appreciation for the birds of prey and find them quite beautiful. So can you talk about how different that view was then?
It's nationwide. The eagles are everywhere, and the species of hawks are everywhere, and that is really in great debt to Rachel Carson and calling attention to the bad side of DDT spraying. I was growing up in Woodbridge, Connecticut when Silent Spring came out, and I can tell you there were no bald eagles or hawks back then, and to hear that they're back in Connecticut right now is an enormous tribute to what we did. But before DDT and before that kind of destruction, bald eagles were killed wantonly by the thousands. Bounties were paid in the same way that we did not like wolves, bears, mountain lions, coyotes, animals high on the food chain that are preying on the same creatures, animals that people want. So hawks and eagles would steal chickens, and yes, they would carry off a lamb now and then, an eagle might. They would not carry off children, which is what children were taught in school in the McGuffey Reader. People were raised to be very frightened of these birds and to attribute more power to them. And they were the scourge of hunters who wanted game birds. They were hated by farmers. And there was no end to the number that could be destroyed with everybody's blessings because they were a bad bird. They were pernicious.
Can you talk about one of her great accomplishments? Rosalie Edge established Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. Can you talk about that, the sanctuary in Pennsylvania?
Yes. In 1934, after several years of complaints about the number of hawks and eagles that would be shot in this time of year, right now, hunters from all over the region would go to this Appalachian mountain ridge and blow as many birds as they could out of the sky. It was a wonderful opportunity because the birds came down from Canada along the mountain range, and they funneled into this very narrow area. And you can go up to Hawk Mountain today and stand on that ridge and see where the birds came right past that ridge by the hundreds every day, sometimes 1,000, and just be shot, and their bodies would drop to the valley floor. Then, after several years of trying to get somebody's attention, Rosalie Edge said, enough of this. The Audubon Society is not doing anything. Various bird groups, the American Ornithological Union, none of them were really motivated to combat the hunters and to go up to this remote place and do anything about it. So she went up there. She looked around. It was June when she saw the place. There was no migration, but she did see a lot of shells and spent ammunition on the ground. And she said, how much? And she wrote a contract to say that she would buy the land for $500. It was money that she was not planning to spend herself. She was still in this situation of, well, she was separated from her husband. She felt financially insecure, although he did take care of her. She never felt comfortable. And so she got a friend to make the payment. And then suddenly the Audubon Society wanted in. It wanted to take Hawk Mountain, because what did she know about running a hawk sanctuary, for goodness sake? And there was a tremendous battle over Hawk Mountain's ownership, and she won. And today we have Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, which is the first sanctuary in the world for the preservation of birds of prey. And the first year that the hawk count was done in 1934, I believe something like 10,000 hawks and eagles flew past that killing point, which gives you an idea of how many birds were slaughtered every year for about 60 years that we were tracing it. And it was that point that Rachel Carson returned to in 1960 to get a sense of how the hawks had and eagles had decreased since 1934. So that's where Rachel Carson and Rosalie Edge intersect, is on that mountaintop.
Wow, what a story. We've been talking about the connections between Rosalie Edge, and the little-known conservationist, and Rachel Carson as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. We'll be back after a break. Welcome back. With me today is Diana Furmasky, author of Rosalie Edge, Hawk of Mercy, activist who saved nature from the conservationists. We were talking about Rosalie Edge and her background and her personality, and she accomplished so much in her life by virtue of her incredibly strong personality, and she called many interesting names: the Joan of Arc of conservation, an indomitable hellcat, a common scold. So maybe you can tell us more about her strong personality and that voice of hers.
Well, I think she was able to do what she did, which was be a woman in a man's world, because of her training in suffrage, and also because she was brought up as a very, very spoiled child who got her own way no matter what. So she was in a perfect position, had the perfect character to just go places where other women would not have wanted to go. And she had this very imperious manner. She looks like, people say, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a friend of hers, not a good friend, very, just very regal, very imperious, very aristocratic, very snooty. It put people off, men. She came across as someone who, was better than everybody. You needed that kind of a character to go into the world, and she did not care what people said. When she was called a common scold, which was part of a lawsuit she had filed against the Audubon Society in around 1931, the lawyer for the Audubon Society said, dismissed her as a common scold. She said, "Fancy how I trembled." And if you can hear her, how she would have said that, and a good example of what she sounded like is in a radio interview that she conducted many years after this incident in 1945. WABC radio in New York featured prominent citizens of all kinds, and they interviewed Rosalie Edge, and would like us to hear a bit from that so that you can hear that imperiousness just dripping from her voice.
Okay, so let's go ahead and listen. This is a vintage recording, so there'll be some static and crackling. Yep.
It's our privilege to bring to this microphone on many occasions outstanding people, and today it's our pleasure to introduce a personality whom I think you've all associated with conservation. She is Mrs. C.N. Edge, and chairman of the Emergency Conservation Committee here in New York City. Her whole lifetime primarily has been spent in the interest of conservation, and they've been, she and her group and her friends have been very, very active and have accomplished much in conservation work. Mrs. Edge, I'm very much interested in the conservation caravan, which someone spoke to me about the other day, and I'm wondering if you could tell us when this caravan will be held, why it's held, when it will be held, and what it is, and so on. So let's start with, first of all, when it's going to be held.
Well, Mr. Lampley, I'm just as interested as you, because I had a unique experience with it. Last year, I went in August with the Conservation Caravan, and the moment I got an announcement that it was repeating or having another tour this August, I registered for it at once.
And what are the dates?
The date is the 22nd of August to the 29th, and the caravan starts in Buffalo. I took the plane out to Buffalo from New York. I had a look at Niagara. You never can see too much of Niagara, and besides, there are all these plans to draw the water off and ruin it, and I thought, well, perhaps I'd better see it.
I think that really helps us to hear why she could be so effective against much more powerful and dominant people.
She had no limits. She was everywhere. She went from east to west, north to south. Many states have her imprint without knowing it. Olympic National Park in the west. In Connecticut, I can't think of a particular place, but Roger Torrey Peterson, who is associated with Connecticut, worked for her when he was a teenager. He met her in Central Park birding. He was quite swept away by her power and by her willingness to stand up to special interests in conservation. And he was one of the young men, I think he was about 18, who came to her fine brownstone in the afternoons to lick envelopes, to address and lick envelopes and mail out these screeds to 8,000 or more conservationists who did not know what was going on with the special interests stopping the preservation of bald eagles. She purchased his first bird book, and he inscribed one of his first bird books to her. So, and he later became on the board of directors of Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. He was there for 20 years, I believe. So he had one of many young men who was extraordinarily influenced by this dynamic woman. I don't think he would have said he liked her very much, but everyone respected her, and later on regretted that she had not gotten her due.
The recognition that she so richly deserves.
Yes, right. And he felt that way too. I did interview Roger Torrey Peterson, and he was careful. He knew that she was a tough person to like, but he also knew that the environmental movement, for good or for bad as we know it today, really she was the one who sparked it.
One of the things that I think is so interesting about Rosalie Edge is that she was not trained at all in science, other than what she learned from her very intelligent father. She was able to bring these issues to the public in a way that got people interested and willing to fight for these causes. She was a citizen scientist, and I think that's so important for us to realize today of the difference that anyone can make, even without that science background.
Well, I think what she was the interface between science and policy. And while that happens in every movement, it did not happen in conservation until she came along. After John Muir, who was an activist, and also I should mention an amateur, not of the academy, but after he died, there was really this nothing much going on in activism for conservation. So she reintroduced it, strengthened it, made it everyone's duty to care about nature. You didn't have to be a trained scientist, you did not have to be a government bureaucrat. So the role of the activist was one that she defined in the movement and universalized. And the whole generation of people who came after her, including Rachel Carson, David Brower, founders of the Nature Conservancy, the Wilderness Society. I mean, I could go on with the number of people who have come up to me at book talks around the country and said, Rosalie Edge, she is why I do what I do.
Wow. What I think we would like to see is that Rosalie Edge gets the recognition she deserves now and takes her place in the pantheon of people in the environmental movement. Here at Middlesex, we are hoping that we can educate our students about these issues and have them go out into the world and be good citizens of the world. And it's a world that's facing many, many issues, as we know. What would you say that we can learn from Rosalie Edge's life and work, is relevant today?
Well, what I admire about her and what is always with me is I can always do more. And I get very discouraged. There was just something that happened in my neighborhood in Denver that I am bitterly upset about because I did not do enough to stop it. The destruction of a garden. I did not do my part. And I really, truly, truly believe that if I had done my part and if I had worked with other people sooner, we could have saved that piece of land and kept a 43-unit apartment building from going on it where there will be no green perimeter, not even a green perimeter anymore. So it is so extraordinary when I think about all she accomplished. One person, because she worked alone in front a lot. She did have good science backing much of the time, not always. But you try to do something in your town and you get discouraged and you feel like, oh, I'll never win this, we'll never stop, we'll never get these people to do the right thing. And lo and behold, you can do it. But you have to be committed, you have to believe that it's worth doing. And as she later said to Roger Torrey Peterson, she said she probably should not have been quite so strident. I am not there yet. I think we've been too easy. But one person makes a huge difference.
We can learn so much from what she's done. So I encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Diana Furmasky's book, Rosalie Edge, Hawk of Mercy, the activist who saved nature from the conservationists. This has been the Middlesex Moment Show. Please take a moment to visit our website at mxcc.edu to learn more about Middlesex Community College, sustainability, and environmental science at Middlesex. I'm Christine Witkowski, professor of environmental science at Middlesex, wishing you a good day.